Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Roughly Chinese. I'm your host Mimi, and today I'm joined with a very special guest, Ashwin of International Solidarity Podcast. Hi Ashwin, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing fine. How about you?
I'm really great. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. And I just wanted to ask if you could give a little bit of a brief introduction about yourself. Tell us about yourself, your podcast, any other work that you do.
Yes, of course. I'm Ashwin. I host the International Solidarity Podcast, which is a podcast on broadly imperialism and the global South, perspectives of political economy, that kind of thing. Otherwise, I am a PhD student in Canada studying political science, looking at the political economy of development across the global South, particularly focusing on China and South Asia. Those are the areas I'm most closely connected to in some way. I'm Indian by ethnicity and heritage. I grew up in Hong Kong, though. I'm a second or third generation, depending on how you define it, Hong Konger. And some of my other work has to do with Canada as a settler colonial project, and particularly the immigration angle of that.
Wow, I have literally hundreds of questions for you that are popping up in my mind because there's so many layers of the experiences that you've had, and you're clearly an expert in so many ways. So we have so much to learn from you. I guess I wanted to start this conversation because in our usual stories and in our content, we, are focusing on the mess that is US and what's happening over there politically. But I think it would be so amazing to get a perspective on what's happening in Canada. So just a bit of background as well. I'm Australian, and I do feel like there's, some kind of parallel happening there. I do kind of understand what it feels like to come from or to also be studying a place that is like another extension of the US imperialist state. So I kind of want to ask you about Canada, especially since you're there, and specifically about China-Canada relations. I think lately I have been doing my own deep dive into understanding China-Canada relations. And unfortunately, because of Canada's tether to the US, there's been the whole tariff war. There's been a real big back and forth. And I even have in front of me a whole timeline of the ways that Canada and China have been going back and forth with the tariffs. So I think last year in August, Canada announced a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. And then that was met with China filing a WTO complaint about Canada's tariffs, right? I think Canada also tariffed steel and aluminium products, so anything with Chinese steel. And then after that, it's just been a whole back and forth. October, that's when the 100% surtax actually took place. And then in March this year, 2025, China has been saying that Canada's measures have violated foreign trade law. And then China also announced new tariffs on Canadian canola oil, meals, peas, etc. So that has been, the ongoing back and forth. And I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that is? Why is Canada acting in this way towards China?
Well, you already hinted at it in some way. It is Canada essentially not having an independent foreign policy, right? I think one thing to note before we even talk about, the canola tariffs is the tariffs that you mentioned on EVs, right? And steel and aluminum. It was actually the US that had added those, that had tariffed essentially China in terms of Chinese EVs. And that was in May, I believe, of last year, 2024. Canada followed in October of 2024. So that is the short answer for why this is happening. Essentially, throughout the Canada-China, or you can even say in Canada's foreign policy more broadly, there is a lag between US foreign policy shift in terms of its strategic aims, its who it considers adversaries, geopolitical adversaries, and Canada then not so long afterward following suit. Essentially, that is essentially the short answer to what explains these moves.
Yes, that's a very accurate and sharp analysis, because I think it's very important to see how Canada just kind of echoes what the US does. I also saw recently that because the US was actually imposing a lot of tariffs on Canada, and Canada originally had all these reciprocal tariffs, but then they retracted them, didn't they? What has been like the general response to that, or what are your personal views on that?
They did. I mean, that is, recent news, I think, of the past, 1 or 2 days. Canada did, and this is very interesting. We had a Canadian federal election at the end of April, beginning of May. Leading up to that election, there was a lot of hype around, pushing back against the United States. Elbows up was the discourse, a hockey reference. Full disclosure, I don't watch nor play hockey, so I don't fully get all of the references. But elbows up against the United States. Once Prime Minister Mark Carney was elected, there was a notable tone shift. Some of that obviously has to do with diplomacy, and you are essentially dealing in diplomatic relations. So there's some of that, but there was a cozying up to Trump, and then not so long after, fast forward. Well, I should say actually before the retaliatory tariffs, Canada, since I forget the year, but after 2020, had imposed a digital services tax, which would essentially tax the big U.S. Silicon Valley based tech giants who are operating in Canada. So this was a tax on them, a necessary one. However, Canada unilaterally withdrew that tax in these negotiations with the U.S. In order to try to appear favorable to the United States, and then not long after that, recently, they withdrew retaliatory tariffs, and some people call that elbows down. I think certainly it is, but it also reflects a material reality where Canada actually can't afford to impose such kinds of tariffs and put such a wall up. Canada-U.S. trade makes up about 3% of the U.S. economy, but Canada-U.S. trade makes up about 1/3, or around the 33% mark, contributing to the Canadian economy. So there is a material basis for why Canada essentially dropped those retaliatory tariffs. But the question then remains, why? Why is the Canadian economy so dependent, dependent on the U.S. economy? Since the neoliberal era, there has been really a tightening integration between the two economies, and dependency really to go further than that. Yeah.
Wow, that is a really important distinction also to make. I think the material conditions and the material context here is extremely important. But then at the same time, you have to ask why? Why is Canada so dependent on the US? I think that is a key question at play. And so I guess further then, I've been kind of researching what Chinese viewers and Chinese netizens kind of see and how they view this China-Canada relations. And I saw that they viewed Canada's trade restrictions as politically driven and closely aligned with US strategy, as you said before, even at the cost of Canada's own economic interests. So because of the China now retaliatory tariffs on the canola tax, etc., there's reports of Canadian farmers petitioning the government to restore access to the Chinese market. And so there seems to be kind of some like domestic discontent and civil unrest in Canada. And we also were reading about the airline strikes because there were poor working conditions for the union workers and the people who were running Air Canada. So yeah, what do you know about that? Can you fill us in about the situation in Canada?
Sure. Before I maybe touch on the Air Canada strike, we'll say one last thing about the canola tariffs. Essentially, these Chinese tariffs, against Canadian canola products, China knows where to hit Canada. The farmers, the producers of this canola are largely in the western province of Saskatchewan, not exclusively, but in the western regions of especially Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, this is a politically sensitive region in Canada. If I were to provide a little bit more context, I guess I would quote the leader of the Bloc Québécois, which is the Quebec Sovereigntist Party, who said Canada is something along the lines of Canada is an artificial country with very little meaning, and sort of held together by very sensitive elements. So Western Canada, in addition to Quebec, obviously, who tried to secede from Canada twice, unsuccessfully though, but Western Canada is also a politically sensitive part of the country. And these tariffs essentially create upset, create pressure points, especially for the federal government. Western Canada has a history of disaffection against Ottawa, against the federal government based in Ottawa, the capital. So these Chinese tariffs, they know how to apply pressure. Regarding the Air Canada strike, this is certainly something significant. Essentially, what happened was the time came for Air Canada flight attendants, workers, which we should say is a very gendered profession. So that's one very important element of this this labor struggle, is that it is gendered. It's not that 100% of flight attendants are women, but it is disproportionate. And starting out, flight attendants were 100% women, and that has essentially changed. But essentially, it was time to renegotiate the contract between Air Canada and Air Canada flight attendants, Air Canada workers, as part of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE, CUPE. And these negotiations had been going on for about 9 months to no avail, which is when Air Canada workers declared their intention to strike. And the central issues here were low pay, but especially flight attendants, and this is an industry norm, so-called, in North America. Flight attendants apparently don't get paid unless and until the plane starts to move or it's in the air. So, you can see from the point of view of the employer, from Air Canada, this is because there's a lot of unpredictability. There might be delays, issues with boarding, etc. So they don't want to end up paying their employees for all of that time. So that was a central demand in this Air Canada strike, to receive ground pay, to be paid essentially for the work that they do on the ground.
Wow. I can't believe that's real.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's real. Sorry, I was flabbergasted because I was trying to process that. Wait, so they don't get paid on the ground. They only get paid when they take off or when they're in the air?
That's right. And so essentially, this strike took place. They were going to, that was one of the central demands, to have ground pay. They were on strike for a while, and it took less than 24 hours since the beginning of the strike for the Canadian government to refer this to something called, not to get too nitty-gritty here, but something called the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which is sort of a softer, quieter way to essentially regulate these workers back to work. And that's exactly what the CIRB did, in effect. What's notable about this strike is that the workers striking, they defied this back to work order. And that, from the mouth of the CEO of Air Canada, surprised him. And not long after that, Air Canada came back to the table to renegotiate a deal. The details of this deal haven't been made public, but it seems that there are provisions for on or ground pay, we should say. And however, from sort of early reports, this is not entirely confirmed, that ground pay is still only about 50% of the standard hourly rate of when flight attendants are paid for when they're moving or in the air. And reports suggest that many flight attendants, unionized flight attendants, are still unsatisfied with this. This tentative agreement will have to be ratified, I think by the end of the month, beginning of September, where it'll be put to a vote to QP members, and then we'll see what happens from then on. But this is significant in several ways because in the first instance, this is the first time. It's not the first time that a right to work order has been defied, but I believe it is the first time that a right to work order has been defied, and that has pressured the employer to come back to the table with a better deal. And so that sets a precedent actually for essentially making this right to work order sort of ineffective. If these workers essentially disregarded it, continued to strike, and then won anyway. The second way this is significant is because now if Air Canada is how do we say, if Air Canada is giving this concession of now starting to pay ground pay, the rest of the industry will have to follow essentially.
Right. Yeah. And I think what the workers are striking for is very, very important and essential. And I so appreciate you for diving deep into it, because I think there's a possibility that a lot of people don't know about these things, right? I often think about how obviously the US takes the spotlight with all its mess and its chaos, but at the same time, there are these settler colonies as well that are having so much public discontent and so much public unrest because of the unfair working conditions or the following of US policy. So I wanted to ask you, in general, with the general public in Canada, from what you've noticed, or maybe even your peers, is there a general shift in perspective now about, Western imperialism? Are people starting to realize or open their eyes about Western imperialism? And then in that same sense, is there a shifting perspective on China as well?
I think when it comes to Western imperialism, there certainly has been a shift since the start of the Gaza genocide. I think that that's really opened the eyes of many peers of mine, friends of mine who are otherwise, you can say, maybe apolitical, are as are the rest of us, shocked by the genocidal campaign by Israel against Palestinians in Gaza, and crucially backed by particularly the U.S., but also the rest of the West. So the mask has fallen off on American exceptionalism. The myths were taught about the West and freedom and democracy, this kind of thing, and human rights. When it comes to China, I think as well there has been, you can call it a softening or a reorientation. Several of my peers now, from friends of mine who are, you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, Western propaganda, the Western information system is very effective. It can't be underestimated. So the assumption is that people hold anti-China views, but even I've seen shifts among close friends of mine who can see very clearly China's development trajectory, and particularly, I should say, a lot of my friends are happen to be Indian, and I think it's a little bit easier for us to see China's development and China's progression as something exceptional, because you're comparing it with another global South country. That cannot be underestimated at all. I shall say, though, however, that this is not. I don't think this is a full reorientation among everybody. There's still a lot of anti-China propaganda, orientations toward China that still see it as authoritarian or anti-democratic, or heavy-handed, these kinds of things. That'll take time, and it's up to, I guess, folks like myself, who are Westerners who are based in the West, but also have a background in China, perhaps, at least in my case, to dispel this, to sort of talk about the truth of China's development trajectory, what it means for the rest of the global, what it can mean for the rest of the global South, and what it means for the lives that we live under capitalism, which to say the least, certainly could be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said before, the Western propaganda machine is very, very sophisticated, and like you said, I think the cracks were really starting to show, especially when the genocide on Gaza started to really unfold. And so now that we see all these lies and all these cracks, I really appreciate that people are starting to question, everything about China. But I think you also have a very unique perspective. You actually grew up not in the West, but you grew up in Hong Kong, right? And so I guess I wanted to ask you, how did you, also with your Indian heritage, how did you come to this moment that you're in right now? How did you become so entwined in studying and understanding and fighting against Western imperialism? Having studied or lived in Hong Kong for so long, having proximity to the mainland, etc.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, a big question. You might have to anchor me a little bit if I go on too long, but no, I mean, I mentioned that I'm second or third generation, depending on how one defines it, from Hong Kong. From my paternal side, my grandparents moved to Hong Kong in the early 60s. So this was really, even before the industrial boom, in Hong Kong, before Hong Kong sort of developed or became, one of the four Asian tigers, as they call them. But essentially, I think growing up, I had a very strong consciousness about racism, about colonialism. I'll take every opportunity I can get to remind folks that Hong Kong decolonized, returned back to China only in 1997. Full disclosure here, that's just 2 years before I was born. So essentially, and I've said this before on my podcast, myself and my sibling are the first generation in my family to not live under colonialism. My grandmother on my maternal side, who is still alive, was born in British India under colonialism. My dad and his siblings lived in British Hong Kong, a colony where, I should say, at the time, you still had, white British soldiers in their army uniform walking around Hong Kong. I mean, it was obvious that this was an occupation of a part of China. And then, my mom, who grew up in India, but, got married to my dad, moved to Hong Kong at the tail end of colonialism. So, she also experienced the colonial era in Hong Kong before it was handed over. Also, I think being an ethnic minority in Hong Kong, and particularly I'd say Indian in Hong Kong, gives you a sense of consciousness about racism. Essentially it's a British colony. You have sort of one can conceive, a three-tier system where whites are at the top, and then, you have Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese as the second layer of citizens. And then you have the rest of the ethnic minorities sort of below that. Hong Kong has, a lot of Filipinos, particularly Indonesians, as well as Indians, Pakistanis, other South Asians. So, this British colonial legacy is still very strong in Hong Kong, in terms of racism. So, I became quite conscious about that from quite a young age. It wasn't until, much later on that I, sort of converted that consciousness about racism, about the racial order of the world, into a broader understanding of imperialism, about the political economy of imperialism. That came much later. And then I should also say, growing up in Hong Kong, again, because it was within the orbit of the West, and very strongly so, the media ecosystem in Hong Kong is such that you still have a lot of anti-China influence within Hong Kong. I should say, when we're talking about my peers in Canada that are talking about having anti-China views and sort of shifting from that, I should say that a lot of my peers from Hong Kong as well, still growing up, had anti-China views, and a lot of them still do harbor anti-China views. Again, the Western propaganda machine is extremely strong. So it also took me a while to sort of undo that. It was really when I learned more about capitalism and imperialism and how those two are linked together. Capitalism is not an isolated sort of system. Capitalism, through history grew via imperialism and via colonialism. Colonialism and imperialism were generative for capitalism. And then you learn about the socialist history of China and how the Communist Party of China, the communists in China, essentially stood against capitalism and imperialism, Japanese aggression from the Western powers. And I guess the rest is history from there. It's a lot of unlearning. It's a lot of getting to the truths uncovering the propaganda that we're fed. But yeah, I mean, it takes time, and it'll take time for a lot of people.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. That was like, wow, I'm extremely impressed. And I also have roots in Hong Kong. Half of my family is over there. And I have also grown up going there a lot. And I have seen for myself, how it, like you said, was a British colony. And I think a lot of people also don't understand that context. And I think it's vital and important to broaden our perspectives and understand and connect the dots, which again is what I think Gaza is allowing people to do right now. But it is absolutely essential to do, and also similarly, when I speak to actually younger people from Hong Kong, there is a level of, just like misunderstanding, because the westernization and the British colonial mindset is very deeply ingrained, right? But then when you actually ask, or think about and really retrace the footsteps, what did the UK actually do for Hong Kong, right? It's very interesting, because I don't know. I don't like, similarly with what they did with India. I saw that there was a statistic that, there's this whole parade and charade about the Westerners going to these global South countries and bringing democracy, right? And bringing education, higher levels of education, and, taming the savages is what they call it. And yet when they left, people actually are less literate, right? The levels of literacy actually declined. And the cultures also are destroyed, right? There's genocides, there's slavery, like there's all these different kinds of things. And yet I do find it frustrating when there's a romanticization in Hong Kong of almost returning to that history or wanting to be a part of Britain again. Like that for me absolutely blows my mind, And so perhaps it is maybe because of our background and understanding that part of Hong Kong, they were like, wait a second, let's connect the dots here and let's actually understand the broader context, because this doesn't really sit right with me. There's a lot of contradictions.
Yes, I should say one thing, and I think this is a very important point to discuss. I mean, a lot of younger Hong Kongers associate the West with democracy, this kind of thing, enlightenment, a brighter future, and not maybe not without good reason. A good portion of the Hong Kong Chinese population, migrated from mainland China, often coming from conditions of poverty. That was just the state of underdevelopment in mainland China. So they associate the West with development, and where their family history is coming from with underdevelopment. There are sort of material reasons for that. But when you see the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, as a sort of a regular commentator on BBC about Hong Kong affairs, talking about democracy, essentially the governor, the colonial dictator of Hong Kong, talking about democracy in Hong Kong now, once Hong Kong has returned to China. That's extremely hypocritical. And even for myself, someone like myself, it was only when I heard, this issue about Chris Patten phrased in the way that I just did it really click to me that, we talk about the governor of Hong Kong, they give themselves, amazing names. But these were really, dictators, colonial dictators of the colony. The other thing I should say is a lot of young folks, from Hong Kong, I guess not just young folks, but associate Hong Kong with high levels of development compared to, especially maybe at the time that I was growing up, the rest of mainland China, which was comparatively not as developed. I should say the reason for Hong Kong's development is actually not the benevolence of the British system. And this is a really interesting yet overlooked history. I mean, in China, during the late 60s, the Cultural Revolution was going on, and there was that some of that fervor also had spread to Hong Kong. There were pro-China patriotic schools in Hong Kong that were against the British. They were explicitly anti-imperialist. They wanted the British occupation out of Hong Kong. They wanted to return back to China. There were labor strikes. There was a lot of unrest in Hong Kong in the late 60s and early 70s, to the point where, it was actually if I'm not getting this wrong, it was the Americans that, had sort of pressured Britain to improve the conditions in Hong Kong. And I should remind us, at that time, you still had this kind of, what would be called third world levels of poverty in Hong Kong at that time. There were ghettos, there were slums, there was a lot of poverty. Workers' rights, didn't exist as such. Homelessness, beggars, etc. I mean, these are firsthand, accounts from like my uncle, for example. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, and it was really under the pressure of the Americans and the British as well to sort of prolong their governance of Hong Kong, that they started building public housing, that they came up with a robust public transit system, the MTR. And this is where, this is the history of Hong Kong's development, because otherwise the Americans and the British, the Westerners, were afraid that, the communist, the socialist revolution would spread to Hong Kong and displace the British. So it was really, if Hong Kong is developed today, at least a part of it can be attributed to, the great strides and the sacrifices made by the communists in mainland China and that movement.
Maybe because this is kind of personal to me, but I was like nodding my head furiously because I think, again, that is such important context to understand. I think especially like you said, the British had colonial rule of Hong Kong for 100 years, right? That is like an entire century. And
150.
150. Sorry. Thank you. And how come our parents or our, uncles and aunties, their generation, was still experiencing poverty to that degree, right? Coincidentally, at the same time, there was, like you said, the Socialist Revolution, the Soviets. And so there's like many things, and I also know that in the States, it was similar to that. The boom of like infrastructure and public housing was actually a response to the communists doing that, right? And the Soviets and the Cold War. So that is a very essential piece of the puzzle here. But I think because of that, it tricked people, especially perhaps of our generation, to believe, the British did so much for us because they love us and because they're caretakers. So again, I think this is such important context, and thank you so much for sharing your story. And since we're in this kind of like, personal, telling our own stories, and because I know you're so skilled at what you do, we could kind of switch the format around a little bit. And if you have any questions for me, for your podcast, feel free to ask them.
Sure, I appreciate that, Mimi. Maybe, the since we're, sort of talking about identity, I did want to ask you about, Chinese cities, socialist urbanism. I might ask that a little bit later, but I wanted to ask you how you, navigated your identity as, a Chinese person that grew up in Australia. At what point, and we've been talking about Western propaganda this whole time, essentially. What is your story in terms of growing up as a Chinese minority in Australia, and sort of what did you know about China? How did you feel about it, and what really got your gears turning in sort of understanding, I guess, closer to reality of how China's development was progressing?
Yeah, so I have roots both in Shanghai and in Hong Kong, and my parents were part of the generation that was leaving China to then bring back their skills that they learned when they were getting educated in Western universities. I think that was like a really big trend in the 1980s with the reform and opening up era, where a lot of people from my parents' generation were moving abroad to get educated somewhere else, and then with the intention of bringing it back. And so my parents did the same, and they both landed in Brisbane, Australia. And when they had me, definitely we were just in a place where assimilation was almost like essential for our survival, right? And actually at the time, there were pretty aggressive policies going against migrant workers, especially of Chinese heritage. I remember there was this lady, her name was Pauline Hanson, and she was this really evil Australian congresswoman who very verbally said, we need to stop the yellows, like very aggressive verbiage like that, right? And so that created a lot of hostility towards Chinese migrants and Chinese students as well. So my parents were definitely subject to that. But I am very grateful that my parents actually never stopped or disconnecting themselves from China. And so they would always bring me back either to Hong Kong or the mainland. So I spent significant parts of my childhood coming back and really seeing it for myself. That being said, like you said, especially in the 90s, in that time when I was coming back, or the early 2000s, China was still in a point of rapid industrialization and development. And so I was seeing these changes. I would remember coming back to China. I would love the atmosphere, I would love the people, I would love the culture, but it is undeniable that at that point, at that stage of its development, there was air pollution, there was less greenery, and there was less socialist infrastructure, or infrastructure in general, just because China was still an undeveloped third world country at the time, and so many of us can attest to that. But I think what is essential is that I think Western propaganda is so confusing because it is stuck on that, right? On that period of China's development where they're always spewing this narrative of, oh my gosh, like the air is unbreathable, right? It's like, people are not eating well, or, the people in China, it's just so scary over there. But then at the same time, at the exact same, in parallel, they're also saying China's economy is intense competition and the high tech is getting out of hand. So it's very contradictory, right? So for me, I was hearing all this as a young person, actually going to China, seeing that some things were objectively true. Yes, the air condition and stuff like that. But then at the same time, that narrative just stuck. And it just wouldn't stop. And it was aggressive. It was like, these Chinese people are uncivilized, they're dogs, they're this, they're that, they're dirty, they're poor, all this stuff. So of course, I think as a child, I became quite shameful. I became quite isolated. I wanted to emotionally distance myself from China. But like I said, luckily, my parents didn't allow that. And they also, made me speak Chinese. They always helped me stay focused and grounded in my roots. I do think as I got a bit older, when I went to university, things changed a little bit, or I started to, independently go and search for more things and kind of defy my parents a little bit. So I definitely was affected by the Western propaganda, and I started to believe it. I started to think, oh God, like China really is a terrible place, and it's really scary and very unsafe. And then I remember actually, again, being forced, or not forced, but being encouraged to come back here to see my grandparents. And I remember I actually told my friends in Australia, I said, they said, where are you going? I was leaving for a month. And I said, I'm going to Thailand. I lied because I didn't want to say that I was going back to China. I just felt so ashamed of it. But then I came back and I saw significant changes. I saw the infrastructure shift. I saw the bluer skies. I saw so many trees being planted. I saw people feeling more at ease. I saw, just a general different kind of atmosphere in the air where people were able to afford like certain things, especially food, housing, clothing, etc. And it has only gotten better from there. And I think luckily for me, because of my rootedness, my parents, my connection to the motherland, I have been able to stay grounded in that analysis. But I would say it is only probably in the last 7 years that I've really put my head down and studied it and kind of seen everything in a broader context and learn about the communist history of China. Not only, China has developed so quickly and so amazingly, so brilliantly, but why? And it is because of the Communist Party of China. It is because of communism and socialism. So yes, the Western propaganda machine works hard, but I would say I worked harder against the grain, and I really, really tried to swim against that rapid. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I also wasn't surrounded by my parents and also by comrades who were not even Chinese and who very much pushed me in that direction, who encouraged me to be like, you have to look at it in a broader context. Because yes, you could see a Western headline and, take it out of context, but it's really important to trace back and to understand not only what China's current conditions are, but how China got there today.
That's an interesting point. I might share a little bit, and then I'll ask you a follow-up. Yeah, we're sort of talking about how Hong Kong folks in Hong Kong are very much propagandized. To be anti-China, or there are these elements. It's not the totality of things, but a big reason for that is sort of the development differential. So, all the things that you're talking about growing up in Australia, uh, you know, uh, having the stereotypes of Chinese as being, be it what it may, like dirty or these kinds of things. These were also stereotypes of quote unquote mainlanders, growing up in Hong Kong, when mainland tourists would come to Hong Kong. And just a little bit of reflection here. I think about this often. These are essentially the same people, Chinese people, many of whom, Hong Kong people are coming from other parts of Guangdong, and migrating into Hong Kong over different parts of history, and yet there's this animosity fueled by and created by imperialism against one's own people. So it happens in the Hong Kong mainland case. It happens in the Taiwan mainland case. It happens, on both sides of the Korean Peninsula. It happens in my contact, context, South Asia, right, with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, whose people sort of exchanged. Was never a politically unified unit across the subcontinent, unlike China, but still had quite a bit of people-to-people exchange across different parts of the subcontinent, and yet in the name of Hindu Muslim, in the name of India, Pakistan, and all the other cases that I mentioned, there are these intra-people divisions, and these are long-standing issues that will take maybe centuries to sort of to move beyond and to reconcile. It's something I think about that's sort of really sad, but cause for work and cause for struggle at the same time. I did also want to reflect a little bit on the lack of development. That perspective. The last time I had been the last time I had been to mainland China was this year in May. But before that, the last time I had been to mainland China was 10 years ago, and in that time you can really see a difference. I remember, even going back further, in I think my first time in mainland China was on a school trip. We went to Shenzhen, and I don't remember it so well. I was like maybe 10 or 11, but what I do remember is, walking around this mall. It was largely empty. It seemed sort of, run down, you could say. Fast forward to my trip in 10 years ago, around 2015. It was another school trip, but that to a rural part of Guangdong in the north. And yet, even though it was a rural area, there was this amazing infrastructure. There was this in particular, I remember this really high up bridge in the mountain. That region sort of bordering Guangxi is sort of mountainous as well, and Guizhou. So you had really tall bridges and infrastructure, that kind of thing. And then, of course, fast forward 10 years, I didn't go back to that same rural part of Guangdong, but the differences are still immense. I had been to Shanghai as well in 2015, and you can see still the differences in the urban centers 10 years ago and today. But I guess here now, maybe shifting gears, I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about development. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on city life in China. I really find your Instagram stories really quite interesting. They give sort of firsthand accounts of urban life, of city life. You focus a lot on the elderly, which is amazing because elderly are often overlooked, and especially by the capitalist system. Once you're done being a worker, you're sort of thrown off. But life for the elderly in China is quite frankly, seems great. At least for a good portion of elderly. Maybe I just wanted to ask you a little bit about public safety in China, in cities. And I ask that because I'm based in Canada. We're based in the West, and cities here have become remarkably, I don't know if the word is unsafe, but at least remarkably unpredictable and sort of crisis-ridden. And I use that word carefully because as the economic situation worsens, there's a greater level of homelessness. There's infrastructure sort of eroding. There are drug crises, and I think it's important that the issue of homelessness and drugs are not seen from a kind of punitive, inhumane kind of way where some people will say just get them off our streets and use this inhuman language. But at least what one can say is that these situations create situations of insecurity, uncertainty, possible chaos maybe, and I think most of all it creates a situation of a crisis of human dignity. How does one react when you see people on our streets treated in such an indignified, inhuman kind of way, and then you sort of have to keep walking or turn away? This is a crisis of inhumanity, and I think that contributes to this lack of security, or the sense of insecurity when you're walking around. And then I could go on and on about infrastructure in the West. But tell us a little bit about how you've traveled all across China in cities. How is this issue of public safety, public security, homelessness in particular? What is that like? Does many people say homelessness does not exist, at least in the big cities? How do you see those issues from the firsthand experiences that you've had?
I mean, this is a question I'm extremely passionate about, and I'm going to try to link it to some of the very important points that you made before, especially about, I guess, people's mentality when it comes to being the after ripple effect of being colonized, right? But anyway, I'll start with my everyday life in China, I guess. And I think as a woman, I think that is one of the most deepest concerns, and something that I am so deeply I care about, right? Because I actually lived in New York for 8 years before I moved to Shanghai. And New York is everything that you just described. The unpredictability, the chaos, the erraticness, and it is so scary because New York is technically one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And yet you see drug use on the street. You see homelessness everywhere. And because of those very intense and undignifying living conditions, people are aggressive and they're unhappy and they're extremely dissatisfied with the way that nobody is there to help them. Nobody is there, and there's no structural help to get these people out of their current situations, right? Because again, I think because the West is so individualistic and there's this capitalist mindset of, oh, this person is on drugs and that is their own fault. They're inherently just a waste or whatever. Because of this harmful mindset, people are not questioning the system at play that is causing the raising rates of homelessness. They're not questioning why the drug use is going, higher and higher every single year in the West. And so when I was about 30, I turned 30, and I turned 30 in New York, and I just realized, I'm not an American citizen as well, so living in the US as a non-American citizen is also very precarious, and I have the anchor and the privilege of being able to have a home in China. And so, of course, I really started to consider moving to China. And as I did, I really realized that I'm a weight is off my shoulders. I can breathe. I don't have to look, behind me every second of the day. Truly, when I was in New York City, people are genuinely scared to go home at night, right? Or they're scared to walk on the street at night. And there is a good reason for that. It's not even an exaggeration. I've been on the public transportation system. There's been people armed with knives just pointing them while sitting down. There's people sleeping on the trains, but then getting arrested for it by the US military. It's just so almost dystopian, but that is the reality of a crumbling Western empire. In China, the ease that I feel, of being able to walk at any moment of the day, especially deep into the night, walk on the streets, I feel extremely safe, extremely protected. I see one of my favorite things and like you said, I really like to document everyday life, and I'm not just here to document the big skylines or the amazing AI technology, right? Sure, that's all very impressive. But for me, I also love to be on the streets and then see a moped that is, the key is in the ignition and the driver is somewhere else, right? The driver is usually maybe a delivery worker or delivery driver who is a working class man, and he just leaves his bike on the street with the bike in the ignition. That could never happen in the West, and we know that, you know? I see kids on the street all the time. The other day I saw children playing musical chairs, right? Just outside at like 11 p.m. with a bunch of chairs that were outside. And this kind of vibrancy, you know, the elders who go exercise every single day, who go to the parks and who dance together, I think that for me is very moving because it shows a generation that fought a revolutionary struggle and gets to enjoy the fruits of their labor today, right? Who lived in a time where China was developing and going through extreme poverty and recovering from the century of humiliation and Japanese aggression, and were, you know, promised all these things by the Communist Party. And I understand that maybe at the time, you know, there was some kind of skepticism or uncertainty, but these promises have been fulfilled. And I don't just obviously talk about urban life. I mean, Shanghai is one of the best cities I've ever been in. It's unquestionably the most convenient place I've ever been, the safest city I've ever lived in. But this also applies for the rural areas as well. And I haven't been to all the rural areas in China, but the ones that I have been to are just as clean. They're just as safe. In fact, they're even more communal because the communities are tighter and they live more in proximity, and they literally, all their doors are wide open, unlocked. You know, nobody is scared of theft or crime. It's just like, we're in the same village. Come over, eat with me. I don't know who you are. I don't know your name, but you're my family, right? That is a mentality, and it's beautiful. It's utterly beautiful. And I really devote a lot of my time trying to dispel Western propaganda, but the questions that really personally bother me, you know, like for example, about the safety or the cleanliness or the cultural hegemony that apparently China is facing, but actually is what the West has tried to do. It's just all so hypocritical. But also in, you know, the rural areas as well, the culture is alive and well. And if anything is being revitalized, you know, I'm very passionate about rural revitalization. And I also think that all the developments that are happening in the urban areas, you get to see the own version of it in the rural countryside as well. All the rural villages are connected to WeChat, Alipay. They're not just isolated and marginalized, you know, by their own rural systems. They maintain their own culture, they maintain their own customs and traditions, but at the same time, they're not on the fringes of society, right? They get to sell their fresh farm produce directly to cities. I just went to a village in Guangdong, actually, and it's great that we've been to like similar regions, right? Because you've also seen the changes yourself. So this village is famous for lychees, and I think Guangdong region, they're very famous for lychee trees and longyan trees and this beautiful fresh produce. And there's a bunch of farmers over there who sell their produce. And a way to do that now is through live streaming, right? Is through going online, staying at home, going online in front of a camera, and then being able to sell all these fresh produce. And then the best thing is that you can also get the produce delivered to any part of China within a day or two. And so I got lychees, fresh lychees shipped to my home in Shanghai from that Guangdong village within a day after they were picked from the trees, from farmer to consumer, right? Like there's something about that where these farmers can make money, not just in their little communities, because that obviously gets very competitive and you can't make that much money from that, but they can expand their businesses as well and directly pay the farmers to enjoy the fruits that they grew. So I went on a bit of a tangent, but these are all the things I love about China, and I can go on and on and on because I think these are all parts of daily life that are very important, and they show the socialist path that China is on.
Thanks for that, Mimi. I have, several follow-ups. I mean, anchor me, let me know when we need to wrap up and things like that. But I wanted to reflect on what you said about how in the rural area people sort of leave their doors open, and there's that kind of an attitude. And this leads into my next question, but I wanted to share recently when I was in Beijing. I was it was my first time in Beijing. It was near, I think it was Hohai Lake, and if I'm not wrong, and there were some homes. I was a little bit lost. I was looking for food. I was alone. I was solo traveling, and I noticed these small homes, and on the street that I was walking on. This was relatively late at night, maybe 10 p.m. Around that time. And I needed to check where I was going, where I could get food, so, and obviously I'd been walking the whole day. I really needed to sit down. And these homes, they sort of had structures in front of them that sort of provided a little bit of a bench kind of thing. And my initial instinct was, my feet are hurting, my back is hurting. I sort of want to sit down. This is in front of some people's homes, so I maybe don't want to do that. I don't know if they're okay with it. Certainly in the West, this would not be okay. But I just needed to check quickly, so I sat down, I rested myself, and started to check. Not long after, I think the person from the home itself, or at least a door next to it, came out, and I thought I was going to be confronted. But he was just taking out the trash, put it out front, went back in. And, this is, I think, leading into a discussion about sort of how public space is perceived, how it's used, right? In the West, there's this, huge emphasis on, private property and sort of defending that. I mean, I can't even, I have to be very conscious if I'm walking my dog and my dog steps on the lawn of a neighbor, right? Like, let alone like forget peeing or anything like that, just stepping on it. And I've been reprimanded for that because it's their, so-called private property. I think existing in public space, I mean, even growing up in Hong Kong was much easier. It was, you could just be in public. In the West, I can say that, being in public space is meant for transit. It's meant for transit between your home or a place of commerce where you have to pay money. You can't be in public. Otherwise, with time, there are loitering laws. There's policing, whether it's by actual police officers or by hired security guards, particularly at night. Parks themselves, they'll close at a certain time. There's sometimes not adequate lighting in parks at night, so it's not meant for you to be in public at that time. Versus growing up in Hong Kong, I could feel like I could feel at home in public space, and I certainly also felt that way in mainland China as well when I traveled there. I mean, maybe another reflection I'll share is that I was in Chongqing and I was in front of the I believe it's called the People's Hall, the Great People's Hall, and something along those lines. Forgive me. And then opposite that is a museum for the Three Gorges Dam. Okay, learned about that growing up. Very the pride of China. Once the museum closed, people in front of the Three Gorges Dam Museum, kids and adults alike, were playing badminton. And there were police cars, sort of stationed right next to it. I have a video of this because I found this sort of mind-blowing after living in the West for almost a decade. This would not be allowed to happen. You cannot have a recreational time in public, let alone in front of some important museum. A guard would escort you away, would say, this is private property, you're not supposed to be here. And again, you see this with elderly and their dance parties, that kind of thing where anyone can join. So, I put a lot here and I've gone on for a bit. Again, like I said, please feel free to anchor me whenever. But I wanted to get your reflections on public space. And, you also, lived in the West, both in Australia and in the US. How do you distinguish or how do you contrast the way public space is perceived and used between the West and in China? And very importantly, what does socialism have to do with that?
Yes, I, again, really, really love that question. It's something I'm personally very, very passionate about. But I do think that, especially in, let's say, New York or anywhere in the West really that I've been to, the whole concept of public space is that, like you said, it's transit. don't get too comfortable, like even I really distinctly remember the park benches in New York City. They would always have a little arm in between, a very uncomfortable one. So nobody can lay down. No one can be at ease. No one can actually like sit very comfortably. It's just a place that you rest for a little bit and then you got to be on your way. Also, like you said, that heightened sense of, I don't know, like alertness, like stepping onto people's private property, being very scared that you're in the wrong territory. Or, especially in the US, I remember going to upstate New York, just an hour out of the city, which is very hard to get to actually, like on public transport, but going all the way up there. And then just walking around in the more suburban regions, being scared, like physically scared. And I was with friends who are black, who are brown, who are not white, and who were walking in these suburban areas terrified, being like, if we step in the wrong turn, because it's not just like gated, but it's also, plots of land, plots of occupied land that these people own. And then you're just scared to step onto the wrong place because of the gun laws, because people are in their rights to shoot you if you're trespassing. So it is so ridiculous. And of course, I think that conditioned me to be super on edge living in Australia too, even though the guns are not like that over there. But because of that, the privatization of land that is not even their land has created this idea of like, oh gosh, I'm always in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not welcome here. Where is the space for me? The only space that I can exist in is the one that I paid for, right? Is the one where my name is on the lease. It's my private space. But in China, in contrast, every space is for the people, right? And the way that people utilize public space here, I honestly laugh at it, as in not in a way that's ridiculous, but in a way that it's just like, it just it fills me with glee. It's almost just like, what? Like, I realize how bad I had it in the West. It's my favorite thing to take photos of, but you can go under a bridge and people are setting up elaborate card tables and mahjong tables just to play these games. Very, very elaborate. Even in the parks, again, these really subtle things. There's like a coat rack for people to hang their bags. This kind of stuff makes a really big emotional and mental shift. And again, it is the difference between a capitalist society and a socialist society, where for socialism, public space is actually in the hands of the state. And so the state can build upon this infrastructure for the people. Whereas a lot of the public spaces in the US are also then controlled by private capital, right? Or then there's so many restrictions on them, or there's such police presence over there that is not there to ensure safety, but is there to tell you when you can and cannot be there and how you can utilize this space. It's still under a capitalist term. And so it's just very felt, the differences that I've experienced here. Public toilets are one of my greatest passions in life, because the Chinese public toilets are, you can walk 1 meter and you can see another one. Every few steps, there's another public toilet, there's another public toilet. And every year they're getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. Also in rural regions, it's compulsory, the toilet revolution, where there has to be clean, new toilets in villages and in rural areas. So the public toilet system is very, very sophisticated here, and they're abundant. Whereas in the States, the only toilets that you could use are ones in Starbucks or private capitalist conglomerates, and you'd have to pay $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 just to get a coffee or a drink, just to access the bathroom. And then when it comes to 24/7 public toilets in New York, they're either so run down, so dirty, so crumbling, right, that nobody wants to use them anyway. And I heard that, and this might be wrong, but I heard that in Manhattan itself, in terms of public 24-hour toilets, there's a handful, maybe like 3 or 4 operating ones. Whereas in China, there's hundreds. In Shanghai, there's hundreds and hundreds. So there's a huge difference here in the ways that people are treated, humanity, human dignity. And I actually feel like the biggest takeaway from my time in China is that I actually feel like a human being here. Going back to your point before as well about, this idea that maybe people in Hong Kong or people in Taiwan have about Western democracy and Western freedom. Sorry, the doorbell. Sorry, I'll do that again. We'll edit it, of course. Like I was saying before, I think what really frustrates me when it comes to people perhaps in the global south who think about Western democracy and freedom, I've been thinking so much about what freedom actually is, right? And I also posted a little quote, like a little thought and reflection I had on Instagram a few days ago, where I said, what is freedom if not, first, covering the basic needs of the people, right? Of food, of shelter, of basic human needs and dignity, making sure that people's everyday needs are met. What is the point of being able to say this and say that and express this and express that? Even though that's not even true in the West because there's so much censorship when it comes to Palestine. But what is the use of that when people are struggling to eat and they're struggling to go to the toilet? Do you know what I mean? There's a reason why New York smells like pee all the time. And it's not just like a quirky little New York is so wild situation. It's because the people are denied the access of public restrooms, which is a basic human right.
Absolutely. I have one last question, and you can take us back from there, Mimi. But maybe some reflections before that. Forgive me. But in terms of public washrooms, I must share that when I was in Chongqing and on the metro, the subway, whatever it is called, on the metro system line, at each stop, and I have a photo of this. On each stop, you have a washroom sign above it. Some of them were in different colors. There were some in green and there was some in yellow. And I had to sort of look at the legend to see what the difference was. But the green was that there was a washroom inside the metro station, and the yellow was that there was a washroom right outside the metro station. But every single station had a washroom sign on it, so there wasn't a single station without a washroom sign. That is, this is basic human dignity and decency. You don't even get that really in the West, and so that's a real issue. I had one more thing. It's escaping me. Maybe it'll come back to me. But I'll ask you my question here. Another thing I noticed when I was in China this time, across the different cities that I'd been to, was that at least around half of the vehicles on the road are electric vehicles. Give or take in different cities. I know in Chongqing, like you don't get electric scooters as much because it's a very hilly city. So that's all gas powered kind of scooters. But electrification of cars, that's a real jump that's being made in China at this moment. I was just talking about public transit. There's this meme I'd seen not too long ago comparing the subway system between Toronto in Canada and Chengdu, and it was it had two photos from one from I think sometime in the 2000s and the other one in 2020 or whatever. And the Toronto photos actually had one line removed from the 2000s till today. Otherwise, it's the same. And Chengdu went from nothing to having a really elaborate, metro system. And I know for a fact in Chengdu, the metro system only opened in 2017. That's very recently, and it's state of the art, etc. So tell us a little bit more in cities about how people move around. It's not like people don't use cars at all, but there is a robust public transit system that obviously differs from different city to city. In your experience, tell us a little bit more about that. How do people get around? And again, this is going back to public space. How do people get around? How is public transit emphasized? Or not, or the extent to which it's emphasized. Tell us about that.
Shanghai is one of the best metro systems I've ever encountered in my life. I mean, not only are the metros extremely clean, extremely fast and efficient, they come every 3 minutes. But also one of my favorite things is that, there's been responses to situations that could happen. I think when I've been to other countries that do have like pretty decent public transportation system, but sometimes there's a problem of, for example, suicide rates or people jumping onto the tracks or accidents happening and people falling in. So literally, like, as a response to that, a very rapid response to that is that they built the barriers that made it impossible to fall into the tracks, right? The response to people's needs is so fast and so smart and so sophisticated. I mean, not only that, but there's some of the like fanciest stuff that you wouldn't even imagine could happen on public transport. For example, on some of like the screens that tell you the arrival time, it also tells you how crowded each carriage is. It tells you the temperature of each carriage. I think I saw that in Chongqing as well, where you can choose a colder one or a less cold carriage. It's really, really sophisticated the ways that it meets people's needs in ways that those of us who have lived in the West know we're just happy that the train is here. We're just happy that the train arrived, because I have been in nightmare situations in New York City where I've waited 45 minutes for a single subway, and then it'll stop in the middle of the tunnel where you're completely like devoid of signal and reception, and anything could go down. The lights turn off. It's like quite terrifying, and you can feel the crumbling of the infrastructure. And so not only is public safety at hand, but you're also going into these trains and you're wondering like, oh God, what's going to happen today? It's just every day feels like a gamble when you're in the West, right? And then nothing is done about it. There's no improvements. There's no change. The only change that I've seen in New York subway systems is that they've created more barriers when it comes to the payment systems. But it's more expensive as well. I think now it is $3 per ride, which is ludicrous. Whereas in Shanghai, it is 30 to 40 cents per ride for your everyday person. But of course, for elders and retirees, it's way cheaper than that. So there's so many things to consider here, right? But I would say a lot of the people in urban areas use the metro systems. And again, it's not just the tier 1 cities that get them. It's tier 2, it's tier 3. I've seen very sophisticated metro systems in all different cities. And then on top of that, if the metro system, we can expect a very robust metro system in urban areas, and I always got to bring it to the rural areas. The same village that I went to in Guangdong recently, the metro system reaches the village, right? How wonderful is that? You can drive or get on a scooter for maybe about 10 minutes and you can get to the nearest metro station. And it's very out there. It's about an hour and a half drive from Guangzhou city. And I know that the Greater Bay Area, like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, they're all actually starting to be connected by the metro. So not only are you connecting cities to other parts of the city, but you're connecting different cities to other cities. I mean, you can go from Shanghai to Suzhou as well on the metro. So China is just building this network that is connecting city to city, making it easier not only for everyday, office workers or 9-to-5ers, but also the rural villagers to go into the cities to sell their produce or just to experience city life as well, and vice versa for the urban population to go to rural regions and to be more well connected. It is really, really incredible, the public transportation that I've been able to experience and witness here. And I only believe that it's going to get better. We're not even like fully there yet. This isn't the end. And that's another part of China that I love. There's just constant improvement and reaction and involvement. There's always a response to the people's needs. Whereas in the West, it's quite the opposite, where things are deteriorating and crumbling. And then the money is being put into privatization and capital. So
essentially, I mean, seems like there's two conclusions from that. Well, I guess the first thing to note is that, we're talking about this development in China, and let's remind us that this is not like a first world country. This is not an imperialist country. This is a developing nation with such standards. It's really impressive. Often, I tell people, in terms of thinking about China and thinking about its development trajectory, don't compare China to the West. Compare it to, other global South countries. Compare it to India. Compare, comparable population, etc. And you see the difference. But in this case, when it comes to public transit and a whole bunch of other things, you can compare it directly to the West, and it is better. It's far more advanced. It's more ecologically sustainable. The list goes on and on. The other thing I wanted to say, which is what I had forgotten earlier, talking about public life and all this. It seems like what we're saying, and we haven't really put it into these words, is that it seems like the West, is looking a little more authoritarian, and anti-democratic, if you will, in terms of how public space is used. It's extremely policed. You feel like, or many people feel like they're in sort of occupied territory, especially in the settler colonial urbanisms, right? Where you can't move around, unless it's your home or unless you're ready to spend money somewhere in public. That doesn't sound like freedom to me.
Thank you for saying that. I totally agree. And yeah, I think all these things that we brought up today are so essential in really understanding China. Like you said, we can't look at China as a first world country. We have to consider what China went through, the century of humiliation, the Japanese aggression. And then also, I think China itself has never claimed that it is a developed country. China itself also calls itself a developing country because there are still areas that are experiencing some level of poverty. Even though extreme poverty has been eliminated, there's still now the revitalization stage. And so China is saying, okay, we are still developing because until our entire country is commonly prosperous, will we call ourselves a developed country? Whereas I think the West doesn't think like that at all. And then I think going on a full circle moment, the electric vehicles, they've improved the air quality, they've uplifted the local economy so much. And I wonder why Canada still imposes the tariffs on them. But Ashwin, thank you so much for joining me today. That is all we have time for, even though I can talk to you for hours about this kind of stuff. And I hope that you can come back to China soon and experience for yourself the amazing infrastructure, the public life, and then maybe we can go to a rural region to see it as well.
That would be fantastic, and it's for certain. I'll be back in the mainland. I go back to Hong Kong, so yes, maybe we'll see each other in the mainland at some point.
Yay, that is amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ashwin, and thank you so much, everyone, for watching this episode of Roughly Chinese. Please stay tuned for the next one and like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know what you want to talk about next. Thank you. Bye.